All right, there we go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Site's inaugural Site's Fourth Tuesday Speaker Night. My name is Lenora Henson, and I'm the Deputy Director here at the TR Site. And I'd like to thank each of you for joining us. We are Western New York's only national park site, and although we are actually managed on a daily basis by a local foundation that is also responsible for raising nearly half of our budget every year to keep our doors open. So in that vein, I want to say a special thank you to all of the TR Site members who are joining us this evening. Your support is always appreciated, but even more so these days. So the TR Site's monthly Speaker Night series is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. Let's see, I do want to make a special point of thanking our sponsors. Let me just get to that screen for just a moment. Hopefully, Mark, if you could give me a thumbs up, can you see the sponsor screen? Okay, thanks. But many thanks to all of the sponsors that make our programming here at the TR Site possible. We couldn't do it without you. And in case you're new to the speaker series, we do record all of them and they are available on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to check those out. Tonight we have a very special guest who is familiar to many of you. Mark Lozo is the Chief of Interpretation and Director of Education at the TR Site. He's held that position since 2001, but he actually started way back in 1990 as a part-time interpreter. And he tells me that his interest in this particular topic that we're going to be looking at tonight started when he was learning the interpretation and learning about some of the obscure early history at the TR Site. When he went to go also do some work at Old Fort Niagara, the interest kind of blended. And Mark is really our barracks expert at the TR Site, so the earliest days of what is now the TR Site. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mark. I'm interested in hearing his talk, and I can't wait to see what he's heard about what he's found out about the barracks. I know he's always looking for new and exciting stuff. So Mark, thanks for being with us, and can't wait to hear your talk. Thanks.
I'm not so sure about the special guest part, considering I'm kind of, always around at the site.
Oh, Mark, don't be modest.
I have become very interested in Theodore Roosevelt through my time at the site, but my personal interests were always a little more inclined towards military history. So when I was doing my research at the site, when I first started there, I thought it was surprising and personally interesting to find that there was a military connection there. That was surprising to me, and it was something for me to have a little bit of special engagement in, even though it wasn't really something that we were meant to talk about on the tour, because it's not really what the Theodore Roosevelt site is about. So normally it's something I never get to talk about. This is a rare opportunity for me to do that, but I ended up doing a fair amount of research on it, largely on my own time. And it did kind of seem to keep resurfacing, as sometimes it happens with something that you're particularly attuned to. It keeps coming up over and over again as you just go about your ordinary everyday life without any particular intention in some ways to seek it out. It just sort of keeps coming up over and over again. So I ended up knowing a fair amount about this. So let's get started about what this is all about. We are very proud of the fact, and I would say very relieved of the fact now that we live along what is the longest undefended border in the world. It's a little hard to think of it that way right now, and in fact, given that it's been pretty much closed down in many ways to non-essential travel for over a year and a half now. Thinking of it as a free and open border that we're used to doesn't really seem to fit anymore. Nevertheless, it is largely an undefended border. There are not military forces arrayed and facing each other off along the border. We would not much have wanted to live along this border at many times in the past. For example, certainly during the War of 1812, it was not a place that you would have wanted to live in. But the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817 is what really established this as a largely undefended border. Despite that, though, there have been various periods of hostility along the border since then. Not so much in recent memory, but a number of periods when hostilities arose. And one of them that I'm going to be talking about today is a period of unrest that broke out in 1837 along the border with Canada, and in a conflict that has actually several names. Even Canadians have several names for it. One of them, though, is the Patriot War. This actually was two separate conflicts that sort of
Hey, Mark.
merged into one. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. I know you worked hard on slides and I wasn't sure if you they aren't showing at this point. So I didn't know.
They aren't? Oh.
Nope, sorry.
Okay, hold on.
Or at least I'm not seeing them. Travis, tell me if I'm wrong.
This again. Hold on.
There we go, Mark.
Okay, so this was a conflict really that started as two separate conflicts that interconnected in a way. And the first was a conflict in Lower Canada. Lower Canada was what we would today know of as Quebec. And that area, after about 80 years under British rule, was still very much resentful of the control of British authority, and still really chafing at those restrictions. They were not warming to it at all. We're still used to it today. They still aren't particularly happy about it. But this broke into essentially open revolt in Lower Canada. Now, when I say Lower Canada, as I said, that means Quebec. And when you look at a map of Canada, Quebec is fairly high on the map. Thinking of it as Lower Canada doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it is downriver on the St. Lawrence. So it was considered Lower Canada at the time. The conflict, as I said, was largely ethnic in nature. It broke out in November of 1837, and British troops throughout the Canadas were sent up into Lower Canada to put down this revolt. In Upper Canada, that was seen as an opportunity. Upper Canada would be basically what we think of today as Ontario. And this was seen as an opportunity for reformers in Upper Canada who were unhappy. In Upper Canada, the government consisted of a legislative assembly, which was elected locally, but much of the power rested really in the hands of a lieutenant governor appointed by Britain, who was seen as representing the interests of Britain and of a wealthy elite. And there was a feeling that the locally elected legislative assembly should hold more power. Reformers wanted to urged that along. And the opportunity they saw was that all of the British forces garrisoned in Upper Canada had suddenly been siphoned off. They had suddenly gone up into Lower Canada. There's that up into lower thing, gets kind of confusing, but they'd gone out of Upper Canada. And this seemed like it was a good opportunity. One of the reformist leaders was William Lyon Mackenzie, a member of the Legislative Assembly, a radical member of the Reform Party, who favored not necessarily complete independence from Britain, but dramatically increased self-rule and a much more powerful legislative assembly. The authority of how Upper Canada was run would rest with local people. That was what he wanted to help bring about. He and other reformists called for an armed uprising against British rule. There was, by reports from Canadian historians, a fair amount of sympathy for their general beliefs, their goals, but not necessarily for their approach. While many Canadians, or Upper Canadians, wanted increased self-rule, these people were seen as too radical for most. Most were not prepared to go so far as to raise arms against British rule. That was a problem, at least a problem for Mackenzie and his fellow Patriots, the name that they had chosen for themselves. They marched on Toronto on December 4th with a plan to seize arms in City Hall. Many of the Patriots were armed only with pikes because they just didn't have enough firearms to arm all of their men. However, they heard that Canadian loyalist militia were in Toronto and seemed like they might be too strong for them to carry out their goals. As they came up on the edge of town near Montgomery's Tavern, a conflict broke out with some loyalists. 3 were killed in a skirmish, and the advance on Toronto sort of stalled there at the tavern. By December 7th, loyalist militia arrived. Rebels dispersed, others were taken prisoner. Several of the leaders were arrested. Others fled arrest, and $2,000 rewards were placed on the heads of many of the leaders. Mackenzie, as a primary leader of this uprising, had a $4,000 bounty on his head, but he wasn't waiting around to see what was going to happen. He had fled to Buffalo, and in Buffalo, he began to hold rallies and post handbills calling for support and finding a great deal of sympathy. There weren't a whole lot of people in Buffalo who could actually remember firsthand the burning of Buffalo in 1813. But people were aware of it and still resented it. And for many Americans, this uprising in Canada seemed like it was very similar to our own revolution, to the desire for independence from Britain. Many Americans saw this as a belated continuation of our own revolution and a chance to throw British authority out of North America entirely. An interesting barometer of opinions on the American side of the border actually comes from a young woman named Mary Peacock. I believe she was around 17 at the time. She was visiting family in Buffalo as all of this was transpiring. And she shows in her writings considerable sympathy for the Patriot cause and expressed that she hoped that the ardor of the Patriots would continue. One of several newspapers, the Rochester Monroe Democrat, also expressed great sympathy quite openly. It urged Americans to follow their conscience in deciding whether to support the Patriots and argued that the US government had no right to prevent assistance to the Patriots. The Eagle Tavern downtown became a center for Patriot rallies. Collections were taken up there of money, of provisions, even of firearms for the Patriot causes. Americans enlisted to fight for the Patriots, some out of idealism, some to aid their Canadian brothers in seeking their independence, but also just to help things along a little bit. Mackenzie offered land up to 300 acres in Canada upon victory, of course, and $200 of silver for service to the Patriot cause. And an American, redundantly named Rensselaer Van Rensselaer, was named a general of the local Patriot force that was assembling in Buffalo. They gathered in downtown Buffalo and then began to march north to the town, still a separate town at that time of Black Rock, immediately to the north of Buffalo. And as they briefly encamped in Black Rock, a New York State arsenal in Buffalo was raided and its weapons were seized by the Patriots. The Patriots then continued northward along the river up to the Tonawondas, and US authorities were making little effort to hinder their movements in any way. Prominent Buffalonians were in some cases still calling for support for the Patriots. There were still rallies being openly held, recruits flocking to the cause, supplies being given to them. But a few of the prominent Buffalonians were also beginning to get a little bit uneasy about what was going on and made a public call for restraint in the local newspapers. But those calling for moderation were faced with threats publicly. New York Governor William Marcy issued a proclamation forbidding American interference in what was taking place and preventing further support for the Patriots in their actions against British Canada. General Henry Archularius of the New York State Militia met with the band of Patriots on the New York shore and demanded the return of arms that had been seized from the New York State Armory. But he wasn't met with a great deal of sympathy. He was essentially told that many generous people had given arms to the Patriot cause, and it was impossible for them to keep track of where they had all come from. They would do their best to determine if any New York State weapons were in their possession and promptly return any that were located, but it didn't exactly make General Archularius very confident, I'm sure, that he was going to get results. The Patriots continued to actively operate and recruit in the US, and Mackenzie was moving about unmolested on the American shore. Given this encouragement, he decided to take a bold action, and the Patriots partly crossed the Niagara River and occupied Navy Island. In the center of this map, you can see Grand Island. In the lower right, you can see Black Rock. The center right, Tonawanda Creek coming into the Niagara River. And in the upper left, just to the northwest of Grand Island, you can see a small triangular sort of boomerang-shaped island called Navy Island. To the north of Navy Island on the mainland, you can see Niagara Falls and a spot between Niagara Falls and Navy Island called Schlosser, which will become rather important momentarily. So the Patriots occupied Navy Island, and the important thing to keep in mind about Navy Island is that it's one of the few islands in the Niagara River that was Canadian soil and not on the American side of the border. By occupying Navy Island, the Patriots could actually say that they were holding and occupying Canadian soil. And on this basis, they declared a provisional government. Because of its position, they could receive supplies and had a strong supply line to the American shore from a sympathetic audience. New recruits continued to flood to them, and they planned to use Navy Island as a launching point for an invasion of the Canadian mainland to be coordinated theoretically with other Patriot advances from other areas. The symbolic significance of holding Canadian soil was significant, a lot more significant than the relatively small piece of land that Navy Island represented. Lieutenant Governor Sir Francis Bond Head of Upper Canada was not amused by what was happening, to say the least. Particularly, I'm sure that he was incensed to be accused by the Patriots of high crimes and find that they had placed a reward of 500 pounds for his arrest. Governor Head complained of unjustifiable interference of American citizens in Canadian affairs and of the failure of local authorities to intervene to prevent this. He said that Mackenzie lacked any significant support at home, and the quick failure of his march on Toronto demonstrated this. To Lieutenant Governor Head, he saw the problem as being largely one of foreign interference and not of an internal revolt, and argued that a high proportion of the Patriots that he was facing now were not Canadians, but were Americans. To be honest, his complaints had the ring of truth about them in a number of regards. Colonel Sir Allan Napier McNabb of the Canadian militia was placed in charge of a response to what was going on. He was given command of 2,500 Loyalist militia. It would be up to Canadian Loyalist militia to put down this revolt because the British regulars, again, were all up in Quebec, in Lower Canada. But it was a sizable force that McNabb had, and assembled them at Chippewa right across the river from Navy Island to assume a defensive posture and prevent the Patriots from coming ashore. But their patience would be tried by the Caroline. The Caroline was a passenger boat, a steamer that was American flagged, American owned by William Wells, American captained by Gilman Appleby, cut from the ice in Buffalo, and was being used to supply Navy Island and making regular trips from Schlosser. Schlosser was a small town along the Niagara River. It's part of Niagara Falls now, but it stood about where the power authority intakes are along the Niagara River now. If you drive along the Niagara scenic, can't think of the name of it now. What I still think of it as the Robert Moses Parkway, but the Niagara Scenic Highway now along the Niagara River heading towards Canada. You pass the Power Authority water intakes there, and that's about where Schlosser was. And on December 29th, it must have been particularly galling for the Canadians to watch the Caroline making 3 trips to Navy Island and back to Schlosser, supplying recruits, arms, and other supplies to the Patriots on the island. At the end of the night, the Caroline tied up at Schlosser, which was a key gathering place for the Patriots. Fed up with this, McNabb appointed Commander Andrew Drew of the Royal Navy to deal with it. And on the night of December 29th, he set out to do exactly that. He took about 80 men in 7 boats out into the river at night. 2 of the boats would not make it across. One ran aground at Buckhorn Island, and another was driven off by fire from Navy Island. But eventually, around midnight, the remaining boats would make it to Schlosser, where the Caroline was tied up for the night, and they would attack. It wasn't really much of a fight, actually. According to period accounts, there were 10 crew and 23 passengers on board the Caroline. And the passengers, by passengers, they mean recruits that were on their way to Navy Island the next day. But pretty much everybody was asleep when the Canadians struck and immediately fled. The Caroline was seized by the Canadians, cut loose from the docks, set afire, and towed into the current. It broke up in the rapids and then fell over the falls to the sound of cheering from the Canadian shore. Naturally, Americans were outraged. There were initial claims that there were up to 100 Americans killed in the attack. There were lurid stories about wails of the dying from the doomed burning steamer. The truth is serious, but nowhere near as bad as the period accounts made it sound. In fact, there's only one confirmed fatality. An African-American named Amos Durfee was found dead on the docks, having been killed by the Canadian militia in their raid. Americans continued to panic, though. There were rumors circulating that there were British plans and plots to abduct Mackenzie from the American shore, concerns that Buffalo would be attacked and might even be burned again by the British. And the response was swift. Militia on the American shore were called out to defend the city. Curfews were declared, patrols of the streets were instituted. Militia began to flood into Buffalo from all around Western New York. Mary Peacock was representing the outrage of Americans, and she said, "I do not see what business the citizens of this place had to prevent the Patriots from invading Canada." Americans were demanding redress for this attack. Sympathy for the Patriots was higher than ever, and there was a flood of volunteers. Nobody really knows exactly how many Patriots were on Navy Island. The low end of the estimate was around 500. Some accounts suggest that by the end of December, there could have been 800 or more. And by mid-January of 1838, maybe as many as 1,500. The sheriff of Fort Erie, Ontario, demanded extradition of Mackenzie, but was driven off by an angry mob. On January 4th, Mackenzie was arrested by local authorities in Buffalo to try to calm tensions, but his supporters quickly raised $1,000 bail, and he was moving about freely again. For all of this, though, fear was rising. Mary Peacock expressed this also in her journals, talking about concerns that all of these growing tensions could lead to war. The Farmers and Mechanics Journal urged efforts to prevent the further interference of American citizens in Canadian affairs to prevent this war. President Martin Van Buren was well aware of the concerns and shared them, and established or issued a proclamation forbidding all hostile acts against Canada and interference in Canadian affairs by American citizens. To give teeth to this, he sent General Winfield Scott to assume command of American forces on the Niagara frontier. Scott was a hero of the War of 1812. He'd actually fought on the Niagara frontier in the War of 1812. And his presence certainly lent a lot of confidence to locals. On January 11th, 1838, he arrived in Buffalo with Governor Marcy. Mary Peacock would say that he was very tall and of a commanding figure. Buffalo resident Martha Fitch Poole described him as grand looking, of large stature, and a very imposing manner, and said, "I shall never forget the feeling of security that this hero inspired." And he would quickly be tested when a Canadian schooner in the Niagara River crossed onto American waters. Scott massed artillery in Black Rock to ward off the schooner and discourage it and lead it to retreat back into Canadian waters. But his goal was not simply to defend Western New York and Buffalo from British invasion. He was also here to enforce American neutrality. And one of the key goals in achieving that was to take control of all vessels on the US shore to cut off the flow of supplies to Navy Island. By January 15th of 1838, the Patriots on Navy Island had given up hope. They no longer had a steady flow of supplies and recruits coming for the American shore, and their hopes of invading the Canadian mainland had pretty much dissolved. And the force on Navy Island dissolved as well. They disbanded and straggled back into Buffalo, where some of the leaders would be placed under arrest. And Navy Island, now largely abandoned, was reoccupied heroically by the Canadian militia, and as portrayed by this period political cartoon. Interesting portrayal of what was not perhaps one of the greatest and most heroic of battles. The militia had caused some concerns in Western New York, though. They weren't terribly disciplined, and the militia in New York were locally raised people. They were from the local community, and they shared the sentiments of the local community of strong sympathy for the Patriots. Indeed, some of them had actually fired on British boats. It was felt they couldn't be trusted, so US regulars were being dispatched to the Niagara frontier. Soldiers whose loyalty to the United States would be a little more reliable, and soldiers who would not be from the local community or share the local community ties and sympathies. By January 6th, an ad hoc or improvised force of regulars was beginning to arrive in Buffalo by way of Fort Niagara and reported to General Scott. Army records refer to it as a detachment of recruits numbering about 100 men. And the improvised nature of this force is indicated by the officers who had been hastily detached from as many as 5 different regiments. It's a very quickly improvised force. By January 24th, a Sergeant Taylor would write in a report that the excitement has in a great measure subsided, and the expedition against the Canada has been defeated by the measures of General Scott. He was a little bit optimistic. Things had improved and settled down considerably, but there were still tensions. On February 26th, Second Lieutenant George Field was ordered to depart Fort Niagara and report to Buffalo with his entire effective strength of 1 company. Captain Israel C. Warringer of the New York State Militia was ordered to assume command of Fort Niagara with his company of militia of about 50 men, and his orders stressed the need to secure arms and ammunition stored at the fort. In response to those orders, all arms and powder at the fort were moved to the French castle with cannon stored nearby and under constant guard. Orders were to be very careful as to communications with individuals outside the garrison, and should your post be attacked or any attempts be made on your ordnance stores, you will defend them to the last extremity. The sign of the awareness on the American shore and by American authorities that stores of US arms were proving to be a major source of weaponry for the Patriots. Indeed, the militia at Fort Niagara were also ordered that if practicable, they were to seize any arms passing nearby that were intended for Patriot hands. Reading between the lines here, what's interesting is that his orders did not stress being on the watch for a British invasion. It stressed instead the danger posed by the Patriots. That was increasingly the focus of US forces. By March 7th, Lieutenant Field of the US Regular Army had resumed command of Fort Niagara with his detachment of regulars. In March of 1838, with things calming down on the Niagara frontier, local militia were demobilized, but cross-border raids would continue along the border throughout 1838, particularly on opposite ends as far east as Maine and as far west as Detroit. And things weren't entirely over in the Niagara frontier as well. On December 12th of 1838, approximately 100 Patriots from Ohio attempted to seize confiscated arms and cannon that were held at Fort Niagara. When they approached the gate of the fort, Army records indicate that the guard turned out and charged them with the bayonet. The Patriots were quickly discouraged. They withdrew. A 10-minute parley was held, and the Patriots left disappointed. There would still be some tensions, though. Indeed, in 1840, the original Bronx Monument, this is the modern Bronx Monument, but the original Bronx Monument at that site was heavily damaged by an explosion that was blamed on Patriot sympathizers. All of this concern would lead to a major upgrade at Fort Niagara. I served for several years as a tour guide at Fort Niagara. I'd already been at the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site for several years by this time and had learned about the Patriots War because of its connection to the TR site, which I haven't really gotten to just yet, but I will, I promise. When I started at Fort Niagara, it was quickly apparent that many of the features that are there today actually date back to the early 1840s. And for many people, it might have seemed very puzzling that there would be such concern along the border at that particular time. But because I already was aware of the Patriots War and this tension along the border at that time, I knew exactly why they had been upgrading it. Indeed, there was a lot of concern about Fort Niagara. And an engineer for the Army studying the fort complained that previous uncompleted repair work had left the fort weak and indefensible, indeed in worse shape than it had been before the work had begun. He complained that the whole lakefront was being left devoid of everything and the riverfront abandoned. The riverfront is nothing now but the mere bank of the river. On July 11th, the Adjutant General of the Army recommended that as Fort Niagara will hereafter be regarded as a permanent station and its position an important one, some inspection should be made with reference to what may be necessary as respects a fortified place. And that would lead to a program of major improvements to the fort from 1839 to 1843, including repairs to the French castle, the oldest structure there, the construction of the river wall, and a series of emplacements of 18-pounder gun positions facing Canada, stretching from the South Bastion to the Dauphine Battery on the Niagara River, to the Hotshot Battery, to behind the French Castle. If anyone's familiar with Fort Niagara, there's not a whole lot of land behind the French Castle, but that's because of a good deal of erosion over the centuries since it was first built. Fort Niagara was once quite a bit larger, with a fair degree of more space behind the castle. And there was a battery located there overlooking the Canadian shore. The land defenses were not neglected either. Revetments were added to the land defenses to keep them in good shape. A hot shot oven was added at this point, but most significantly probably was the seawall. The seawall may not be very visible, but it cut down on that erosion that had been shrinking the fort over the decades. But the US regulars were also in Buffalo in a major way. There was still a lot of tension there. Canadian sheriff had actually been arrested in Buffalo and had been charged for participating in the attack on the Caroline and was accused in the murder of Amos Durfee. This obviously led to outrage and demands for his immediate release from Canada. And eventually he would be acquitted. There was insufficient evidence to convict him in Amos Durfee's murder. But tensions And the local community continued really to be very strongly anti-Canadian and pro-patriot. So the presence of US regulars was still necessary. The militia were too unreliable. By April of 1839, this hastily improvised force of regulars had been replaced by 3 companies of the 2nd Artillery Regiment. This was a cohesive unit from one regiment. Colonel James Bankhead was commanding the 2nd Artillery. And by May 6th of 1839, the post at Buffalo was formally established. Sometimes the post is officially referred to as the Poinsett Barracks for Secretary of War Joel Poinsett, better known for lending his name to the poinsettia flower. But truthfully, the Army records almost never use that term, usually just referring to it as the post in Buffalo. The 3 companies, though, were not going to be sufficient, in the Army's opinion, to secure Buffalo from further violence from Britain or from the Patriots. Indeed, by September of 1838, Colonel Bankhead was awaiting concentration of the entire regiment, 2nd Artillery Regiment in Buffalo. And they had a ways to travel. Some of them were coming from as far away as Georgia and Alabama. Colonel Tidball reported that the journey was made by marching, by river, and by canal through Ohio. Post Quartermaster Captain E.A. Ogden was troubled here in Buffalo. He was responsible for providing housing for the regiment, and his task was about to become considerably greater. Soon he might have to house up to 10 full companies of men and 40 officers, and the current buildings were entirely insufficient for the cause. He was concerned and complained that the nearby buildings were too expensive to rent. He couldn't afford to suddenly add that much extra capacity. As it is, the rented quarters in the city were already widely dispersed throughout Buffalo, with the soldiers being spread over a mile throughout the city, and with officers as much as 3/4 of a mile from the men. The hospital was inadequate, and some of the administrative offices were still in tents. Ogden also observed the bad consequences to discipline of locating troops in the midst of a dense population. He recommended instead building temporary quarters on leased land that would be more on the fringes of Buffalo, away from the population. He felt it would lead to superior facilities and be less expensive in the long run, and estimated the cost at about $9,500 and would take about 60 days to build. This was soon an effort to be frustrated, though, because he was finding it difficult to locate suitable land that any landowner was willing to lease to the Army. And he began to complain in his reports to the Army that Buffalo landowners were a bunch of greedy speculators, all waiting for the first opportunity when the real estate market improved to sell their land, and none of them wanted to enter into a long-term lease with the Army. To the rescue came a prominent citizen who probably was aware of the dangers to Buffalo and the benefits of having the security provided by the Army presence. Judge Ebenezer Walden, a former mayor of Buffalo, would agree to lease land to the Army and sign the lease on October 5th of 1839 for $500 per year. If you can see on this map, towards the top center is a bluish rectangle that marks the location of the barracks along North Street. It's quite a bit north of the heart of the city, very much on the fringes of the city in the standards of 1839. This map is actually from 1847, when the city had grown up around the barracks a little bit more. The land that was leased by Walden was bounded by Delaware, North, Main, and Allen Streets. And Lieutenant Colonel Gibson of the Army observed the advantages of the location were its comparative isolation from the town and its proximity to the frontier or the border with Canada. Buffalo resident Martha Fitch Poole, in fact, commented on the isolated nature of this location, remembering the area as rural, heavily wooded, with roads scarcely more than lanes with the exception of Main Street. Delaware Avenue was not by any means the Millionaire's Row yet. It was still a relatively modest dirt road. The barracks perimeter provided some real benefits to transportation to major roads. North Street along the top border of this map. This map, by the way, I haven't been able to determine exactly when it is from, but seems to be roughly contemporary to the post. And North Street along the top would provide ready access to the border and the Niagara River. Main Street on the right side would provide access to Batavia inland. Army records report that it would have been preferable to be a quarter to a half a mile closer to the river. However, the site was seen as on relatively commanding heights. If you go there now, it's hard to appreciate because of all of the tall buildings built around it. But in 1839, those buildings weren't there. And the land is relatively high and probably would have given a fairly good view of the river. Its relative height also ensured that it had fairly dry soil, and some of the land closer to the river could tend to be somewhat swampier. By December 16th, 9 of the 10 company quarters had been constructed, and officers' quarters were nearing completion. And it was none too soon, because since October 23rd, 9 of the companies of the 2nd Artillery were in Buffalo. Period accounts mention an 1840 drawing of the map that I have thus far been unable to locate if it still survives. This map was drawn on the recollections of Martha Fitch Poole. She was a Buffalo resident. She was related to an officer's wife at the barracks. She would have visited it, but not necessarily had the intimate familiarity of someone who lived there, and her recollections would have been from decades later when this was drawn. So I tend to regard this map with a little bit of skepticism, but it is a little more detailed than the earlier maps that I have found. She did remember, though, that the barracks in her description was bristling with cannon, at least from the accounts or memories of a civilian. She described the perimeter as surrounded by a high whitewashed board fence. It's important to keep in mind that this was not a fortification. It was a barracks. It was a place where soldiers lived, not a place they were meant to defend or fight from. And the whitewashed board fence around the perimeter was probably meant to keep soldiers from wandering out whenever they wanted, to keep civilians from wandering in, maybe even to keep wandering livestock out of the grounds, because newspaper accounts suggest that livestock still freely roamed the streets of the city at the time. I'm inclined to think that the cluster of quarters around the parade ground was probably a little bit further to the north of the grounds than what she describes in her map here, or depicts in her map. Probably didn't take up quite this large an area, but there was certainly a parade ground at the center of it. You could note that the main gate was not on Delaware Avenue, but on Main Street, and marked by a large archway, according to her accounts. She described the parade ground as level as a parlor floor and surrounded by a white rail fence and roadway. can also notice company quarters. That would be the enlisted men's quarters, would have been on the north and south sides of the parade grounds. Officers' quarters would have been on the western end, or the Delaware Avenue side of the building. Toward the southern end, and this is supported by other more period accounts, would have been post gardens and sheds and stables for the horses, which obviously you don't want to have too close to your living quarters. And some sources suggest rows of outhouses as well between the stables and the living quarters, which obviously also you don't want to have too close to your housing. The housing seemed to be fairly unpopular with the soldiers and a bit uncomfortable. Captain Robert Clary reported that the brick was of an inferior quality, having been badly burnt, and described the buildings as poorly built. Captain Ogden described the buildings as plain and simple. Martha Fitch Poole described them as simple but comfortable. It's interesting, though, and a sign of how quickly tensions had cooled along the border, that courtesies were exchanged in friendly accord between US and British officers along the border, according to Lieutenant Colonel Gibson. The British officer named James Alexander made some interesting observations of the barracks. He said, "In walking through the barracks rooms, I remarked that the men were well provided with good breakfast and dinner crockery. The messes were good with plenty of vegetables, but the sleeping arrangements were still of the old and bad plan, wooden bedsteads of 2 tiers, 4 men occupying these, 2 in 1 bed. The quartermaster's records do indicate at least that fresh beef was irregular in their diet, and the post did have gardens to provide fresh vegetables." The officers at the post had the opportunity to be a little more choosy about their quarters. When the officers' quarters were completed, they initially refused to occupy them. They said that they had been built too late in the season, were too cold and dank and too damp, and that living in them would be unhealthy. Stoves were moved into the officers' quarters to try to dry them out and warm them up. And by January 16th of 1840, the commanders had lost their patience with the junior officers and ordered them to occupy their quarters at the post. In 1840, the post would reach its peak strength with nearly 600 officers and men and over 100 dependents as well, 45 women and 56 children among them. That's according to the 1840 census. This was a very rare concentration of forces at the time. You have to keep in mind that the Peacetime Army was very small. America had fought for its independence from Britain, fighting for its freedoms against what they regarded as once having been their own army. So America was always suspicious of having a standing army that was too large or powerful. The Peacetime Army tended to be kept very small strength, and it had huge borders that it had to secure, from coastal fortifications in the more populous areas to a large western frontier. Usually they were spread out no more than a company in a particular place and time. Lieutenant Colonel Gibson observed that it was the first and only instance before or since, within my knowledge, of the assemblage of an artillery regiment for continued duty at a single post. As far as we know, the only surviving building from the barracks, though, is the building that now serves as the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site. At that time, it would have been senior officers' housing, again along the western edge of the parade ground, and it was roughly a duplex housing 2 officers and their families, divided by a central hallway, with each officer having 2 rooms on the first floor and 2 rooms above them on the second floor. One of the known occupants was post surgeon Robert Wood, who would live there for many years. His wife, Ann Mackle Taylor Wood, was actually a daughter of future president, then General Zachary Taylor. Ann Mackle Taylor Wood and Robert Wood lived there in the post for many years, along with their daughters with the rather curious nicknames of Puss and Dump. Lieutenant William Chapman was there. He was the post adjutant and lived in that building as well, along with his wife, Helen Chapman, and William Jr. The city of Buffalo, though, was undergoing rapid growth at this time. Ever since the opening of the Erie Canal, its population had just grown by leaps and bounds from about 2,400 in 1825 to about 18,000 by 1840. In only 15 years, about a five-fold increase. Buffalo had become far larger and far wealthier and more influential than it would have dreamed possible just 20 years earlier. Still, though, it did lack a little bit of the refinement of the more established cities along the East Coast. And in this frontier town, the colorful uniforms of these officers attracted a great deal of attention. Mary Peacock would say that one would think that there were some elephants or some monsters entering the room. If a person might judge from the looks of some people, for every eye was turned on them, mine among the rest. One of the regiments featured a military band, and their concerts were a delight to the locals. And another spectacle was when every Sunday the soldiers would assemble on the parade grounds and march downtown to disperse among the various churches for Sunday services. Attendance at Sunday services was voluntary, but I suspect that most of them probably attended if they were not on duty at the time, because it is said by Lieutenant Colonel Gibson that during their absence, the remainder of the garrison were edified in quarters by the reading of chapters in Army regulations. In this frontier town, the officers were, of course, very much in demand as party guests. Lieutenant Colonel Gibson noted that social intercourse with citizens of free-hearted hospitality, generous in their prosperity, whose favor the officers enjoyed without restriction. Not everyone was enjoying this, though. Officer's wife, Helen Chapman, said that she heard of parties and visits, but said, "I know little except by reports." And she was not terribly impressed by the social life in Buffalo. She said that on New Year's, the usually temperate appear extremely convivial and even unable to stand very firmly. And yet they think it all very fine here. There seems no avowed temperance men here. Lieutenant Colonel Gibson said that on the closing of the canal for the winter, the ardor of Buffalonians was turned into the channel of social activities, balls, parties, dinners, suppers, visits, and all manner of amusements verging to excess. Life for the enlisted soldiers, though, was certainly far less genteel. James Alexander, the British officer, said that in canteen there is no liquor sold. This is as it ought to be, in his opinion. But one of the consequences of having soldiers in a civilian population, they were still able to get a hold of liquor quite easily, apparently, because he noted that there were still many defaulters in a dry room. He noticed that only a few picked men, as they are termed, are allowed to go out of the barracks, and said, "I do not think a soldier in the American Regular Army is much to be envied." Later, other regiments would be garrisoned at the barracks. The 4th Artillery would rotate out after the 2nd Artillery, and then the 2nd Infantry Regiment. But by this time, the garrison was no longer a full regiment. By 1844, it was only 4 companies with 218 men, according to the city directory, with Colonel Bennett Riley commanding. The garrison was never really intended to be more than temporary, and as relations with Canada were improving, the limited resources of the Peacetime Army were strained, and they could no longer spare a full regiment in Buffalo, where it didn't really seem they were needed, especially given the fact that tensions were growing on the southern border with Mexico and would soon lead to war there. Also, Fort Porter, a more permanent facility, was being constructed along the Niagara River. Funds had been appropriated in 1841 closer to the river, It was further from civilian encroachment, which had begun to envelop the Buffalo Barracks. And the hastily built structures at the Buffalo Barracks were decaying. As early as 1843, Captain Samuel Heinzelman complained that the buildings were in poor condition. Roofs leaked, they were overcrowded, and entirely unsuitable. By 1845, a Captain Clary's complained that poor maintenance had left signs of dilapidation and decay and requiring extensive repairs. Finally, the post had outlived its usefulness with the opening of Fort Porter and the withdrawal of the regular army. On September 30th of 1845, the Buffalo Barracks was formally abandoned. And Buffalonian Martha Fitch Poole said that it seemed as if all Buffalo was in tears at their departure. The barracks began to be dismantled. Structures were broken down and sold as raw building materials. Martha Fitch Poole said that for some time after abandonment of the barracks, the grounds were more deserted and abandoned than a graveyard. But actually not for all that long. By the 1850s, Franklin and Pearl Street were extended north to North Street, and new homes were beginning to be built right through the parade grounds of the barracks and were taking its place. All of which leads to some questions about just what this all had been about. What lasting consequences did it all produce? Well, the rebellion in Canada had produced some results. It did not lead by any means to Canada's immediate independence. The Earl of Durham had recommended various reforms, many of them just what the Patriots had called for, but they were largely ignored. One change that took place was the Act of Union of 1840, uniting Upper and Lower Canada. In 1849, Mackenzie had been pardoned and returned to Canada and would eventually be re-elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1851. Indeed, eventually, the first Prime Minister of Canada in the 1860s, Sir John A. Macdonald, had, as a young man, participated as a foot soldier, so to speak, in the March on Toronto. Colonel McNabb had been knighted for his efforts in defending Canada, but Captain Drew was far less fortunate and facing death threats had moved to Britain. Far worse off, though, were 90 English-speaking patriots, many, probably most of them, Americans who were transported to a penal colony in Tasmania in punishment for their role against British Canada. Fort Niagara would be a beneficiary with several substantial improvements. Overall, relations with Canada had suffered in the short term, but in the long term, arguably became stronger. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 resolved various disputes along the border, including some lingering disputes from the Patriots War, and served to further cement the peaceful relations along the American-Canadian border. The Caroline incident would also end up clarifying preemptive doctrines, the idea of what sort of actions were justifiable in taking preemptive action, attacking and arguing that it was in self-defense. In the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, the Americans conceded that there was an argument that could be made by the British that they were acting in self-defense during the Patriots War, but nevertheless argued that they had acted completely illegally by invading New York soil in the Caroline incident. The British representatives refused to acknowledge guilt in this regard, but did nevertheless, while still asserting their right to act preemptively and in self-defense, did apologize for the attack. Certainly one lasting contribution was the home that had once been officers' quarters We still don't really know if it was actually built for the Buffalo Barracks or even might have predated it, but it was certainly used for the Buffalo Barracks and later used as the site for the inauguration of the nation's 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, who took the oath there in 1901. For the city of Buffalo, it left a very lasting impression on Buffalonians who would remember it for many years to come, including because of several marriages between local women and young officers. Martha Fitchpool would say that for many years, the barracks years were remembered as among the happiest of her life, and the zest, variety, and brilliancy it added to our young city was fully appreciated by everyone, and Buffalo society was at the zenith of its glory. As for the U.S. regulars who served in the Niagara frontier during this period, they'd done their duty. They had warded off further British incursions. They had reassured the local populace by their presence, but they had also enforced American neutrality and prevented an unnecessary and unwanted war. The effect on the officers themselves was considerable as well, though. Over coming years, many of them would serve in the Mexican War. Many of them would be killed there. Many others would die on active duty, but many more would go on to serve with distinction. At least a dozen officers who served at the Buffalo Barracks would serve as generals during the American Civil War. John Sedgwick, Henry Hunt, Samuel Heintzelman, William Farquhar Berry, Silas Casey, Edward Davis Townsend, Charles Ferguson Smith, George Wright, and Frederick Steele served the Union. Additionally, John C. Pemberton, Robert Selden Garnett, and Arnold Elzey served the Confederacy. Well, that's not to suggest that the Buffalo Barracks had anything magical about it, that it was somehow the barracks the stars fell upon. You have to keep in mind that given the fact that this peacetime army was fairly small, maybe around 6,500 men, in such a small standing army, a lot of these officers would know each other. They would have served together at one point or another. Many of them would have trained together at West Point. A lot of them would have known each other and rubbed elbows. And at a post like Buffalo, where there was a fairly significant concentration of soldiers, many would have passed through it at one point or another, and in some cases simultaneously. Then jump forward to the American Civil War and the need to suddenly vastly increase the size of the American army to put down the rebellion, and the need in the South to create an army from scratch. Both sides needed officers to command these huge new armies. Someone with West Point education and prior military experience was a very valuable commodity, and they would usually be rewarded very quickly with high rank. The soldiers who were young officers in the Army in the 1840s were perfectly situated to become the generals of the American Civil War. They were just the right age, not too old to actively serve, and not too young to have little real experience or to be stuck during the war in relatively minor commands. They were the kind that were just the right age to quickly be catapulted to high rank during the Civil War, and many of them were. So what did they really gain by their time in Buffalo? Well, they gained experience, not really in combat, but an awful lot in the day-to-day life of the Army, and particularly the complexities of large units. In a peacetime army that was so small, where usually there was forces of no more than a company or even less at a particular post, concentration of a full regiment, as we've said, was extremely rare. They learned experience in tactics and drill. Lieutenant Colonel Gibson said that the tactics manual was the pocket companion, and imperceptibly a school was evolved in which both master and pupil got their lessons practically and got them well. Time in Buffalo raised the regiment to such preeminence that it could challenge any other in the Army for superiority in tone, discipline, or esprit. He also pointed out the example of professional British soldiers on the other side of the river and the inspiration they provided. He said the tactical precision and the neat personnel of those British troops gave an insight into and a standard of the work that was before us. They also would have gained experience in logistics, in the complexity of keeping soldiers equipped with everything from ammunition to shoes to food and everything that an army needed to continue to function. Because with these kinds of supplies, keeping the unit supplied became vastly more complicated as the unit grew. The more soldiers, greater the job of keeping them all supplied. The greater the task also for maneuver and to drill and to keep them operating efficiently. When the Civil War broke out, this was a deficiency even for many of the senior-most officers. But some of these officers at the Buffalo Post had gotten a glimpse of the working of a larger force, more than a company at a time. This would aid them in the Mexican War and in the American Civil War. It's not necessarily what made them generals, but I think that it made them more effective as generals when they eventually reached that rank. The sad and ironic thing about it, of course, is that when they would reach the rank of general and be testing these skills, it would be in a civil war where they would be fighting against each other. I know we've got a regular audience today, so you've probably mostly been to the site before, but if you haven't been, you can visit the home today. It shows little traces of its frontier rough edges today, restored instead to 1901 opulence when Buffalo was a very wealthy city, one of the wealthiest in the country. You can see the room where Theodore Roosevelt was inaugurated, and I hope that you have a chance to visit us. So at this point, if anyone should have any questions.
All right, Mark. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Very interesting. I learned quite a bit. As I said earlier, you're the kind of the resident expert on barracks, so I tend to leave it to you. But we do actually have a couple of questions, but any other questions, feel free to type them into the chat. So first question, Mark, did Navy Island eventually change hands to the US?
No.
Oh, it's still Canadian. Okay.
It is. And it takes its name because it had been used by the British for shipbuilding for a time.
All right. And our second question, do you happen to know who Mary Peacock was visiting and how long she stayed?
I don't know who she was visiting. It's been several years since I perused her journals, and I don't recall the relations that she had in the city of Buffalo. And as I recall, her stay was for about 2 or 3 months, but a critical 2 or 3 month period that took her through the more heated period of all of this going on. So she had some interesting observations. Given how long travel took in those times and how difficult it could be, when people traveled, they usually would stay for a while. You didn't travel and visit company for 2 or 3 days. Out of town relatives would stay for a couple of months. It would be definitely wearing out our patience today, but it was somewhat the norm at the time.
All right. I don't see any other questions, but feel free. Oh, wait, okay, let's see. Did any of the officers or installations created following the Patriot War have a role in the Fenian raids?
Yeah, good question. I really don't know a great deal about the Fenian raids. And so I can't comment on that with any authority. I would just say that to my knowledge, there was no particular connection. Obviously, the Fenians were Union veterans after the Civil War who were Irish immigrants or of Irish ancestry. Their scheme was to invade Canada as part of a a plot to somehow or other achieve Irish independence. It was not an American invasion in any kind of governmental or formal military raid. It was somewhat like the Patriots, in fact, in that it was American civilians launching illegal and unauthorized crossing of the border. But I'm not aware of any particular connection to any of those who had served at the barracks. And I'm not really sure exactly where the Fenians launched their attack across the border, actually. Now you've got me curious, though, to want to look into that a little bit to see exactly where their attack was launched from.
Right. Well, another avenue of investigation and
Indeed.
new ways, new things to learn. All right. Again, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Otherwise, we will wrap things up this evening. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or the Q&A. So again, thank you, Mark, so much for sharing your expertise with us. You know, your knowledge on the Buffalo Barracks is much deeper than mine, and I learned quite a bit. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to our online audience. And let's see, so this is actually our last speaker night of 2020. We will be resuming in January of 2022, and we have a very interesting speaker lined up already. So I'm just gonna, I don't have the details in front of me, but I remember being, ooh, this sounds really neat. So we hope you will follow us on Facebook or our newsletter, and we'll get that information out to everyone in a timely manner. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Travis, for your behind the scenes help. And good night, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.